Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we're going to talk about the keys to living a mindful, present, and compassionate life. I think we could all use a little bit more mindfulness in our lives, right? I'm Risa Morimoto, your host, and you're watching Modern Aging, where we chat about innovative and holistic ways to improve our health as we age. Make sure you click on that little subscribe button below and that little bell next to it so you'll be notified of new episodes when they're uploaded. And of course, you could always sign up onto our email list at our website at thisismodernaging.com. Today's guest is Michelle Maldonado. She's a certified emotional intelligence and mindful leadership expert. I listed a few resources down below in the description section, so you might want to check those out after the interview to go deeper into the topic. Through interactive and immersive experiences, she integrates systems of thinking, contemporary neuroscience, and mindfulness with emotional intelligence, compassion, and authenticity to help people flourish from the inside out. So check it out. Today we're going to talk about being present and mindful and how that's all backed up by neuroscience. Before we talk about that, I want you to talk to me about a little bit about your background and how you actually even came to this field.
I love having this conversation because there's so much that we do in the world that requires us or really invites us to be mindful, and then in doing that we can move through the world with a little bit more ease and grace. And that is probably the big takeaway from having been introduced to mindfulness as a young child. And I remember kind of growing up like any other kid and running around, playing in the beach. I lived in a small beach town, or playing in pools, riding bikes. And one day I had the great fortune to be introduced to meditation when I was 7. And I remember when I was first invited to come sit quietly with my great aunt, I was thinking, that doesn't sound like too much fun. I mean, there are pools to be swum in, dirt to be dug, and bicycles to ride. But then I remembered she was my favorite aunt. So there had to be something to this. So I tried it.
So you sat there with her?
I sat there with her. I climbed up in this chair. And the only thing she said to me was she placed her hands on my head and said, "Quiet here so you can be here." And that's all she ever said. She never told me it was called meditation. And then she simply said, "And when you feel ready, just go ahead and get up and go play, even if I'm still sitting here." So what I remember about all of that is that I felt good. I stuck with the practice after I left that summer and continued with it through high school and college. And then in college learned that it was called meditation. Then I started to learn more about it, various lineages. But I really grew up in a very secular-based mindfulness practice. And what I think the gift of that is that I can speak about it to so many people, making it very simple and accessible. And as a leader, when I moved into my legal work as an attorney or even a business leader in business roles, it really impacted how I showed up. It was the quality and nature of my presence. And I remember one time one of my bosses asked me, "What is it that you do that makes your team so high performing?" And I really didn't know how to answer the question because I kept trying to tick through my mind about what. And then I realized it wasn't a what, it was a how. And I just said to him, exactly that. It's not what, it's how. And here's how I do it. Here's how I show up. Here's how I interact. Here's the grace.
So it wasn't like you were teaching your coworkers or the people how to meditate, but it was by you like you meditating or you being mindful.
Yes.
That transmitted to them to act in the similar way? Or?
Exactly, because we have to start with ourselves first. And that's part of the un-American way. Like we all want to jump into being an expert. We all want to jump into fill in the blank and teach other people it, but we have to do it ourselves. We not only have to know it mentally, but we have to integrate and embody it so that we're modeling it. And so then it becomes the default operating system. And then other people notice that and they're like, what is that? What are you doing?
So what are you doing?
Yeah, mindfulness, depending on who you ask, can have a number of different definitions. But I'd like to use a very general definition that really kind of leverages and pulls from the Mindful Nation kind of UK report that says it's really loosely that we're sort of being fully present in the moment to the mind, the body, and the surroundings with a level of curiosity and kindness. So we're not bringing judgment to whatever's happening in the moment, and we're not thinking about the past, and we're not thinking about the future. We're giving the gift of our full presence right here, right now.
I think that's probably really hard for a lot of people.
Yes. Think about it. I mean, for people who are, you don't even have to be in the United States right now. You could be anywhere in the world, but even if you just look at the example of what's happening in the United States across economic lines, racial lines, cultural lines, political lines, there is so much that's dynamic, uncertain, ambiguous, complex, and it's confusing and it's scary. So there's a lot of fear that kind of rises up in any society, any community where there's so much ambiguity. And so how do we help ourselves navigate that? How do we help ourselves stay grounded and clear and not fall into what I call sort of places of judgment and certainty versus staying in discernment and curiosity or wisdom? So a lot of that will be leveraging the power and the practices of mindfulness meditation. So when I just talked about mindfulness a second ago, I didn't say anything about meditation, right? I just said just being fully present, essentially, and of the entire ecosystem that starts with you. Meditation, mindfulness meditation, then, is kind of a mental training practice that helps us to sharpen our focus, which then also helps us sharpen our clarity. And when we can see more clearly, then we have power in choiceful response. When we can't see clearly and we're lost, we tend to react. And when we react, it's more like our emotions are taking control of us rather than us choosing how we wish to respond. And responding doesn't mean we don't acknowledge and process and embrace the emotions. It's just that we don't let it be the controlling factor.
So there's actually science to back this up. This is not just your opinion.
Yes, there's quite a bit. So in the field of neuroscience, there's just been an explosion of research that's happened over the last couple of decades. But here's the thing, that I always like to offer a note of humility, if you will, around the science. Because if you think about the history of medicine being a mile long, for example, that's the history of it. There's all this rich information that we have in it. If you look at neuroscience, it's probably a couple of inches of that mile. It's only been around for maybe 2 or so decades where we really started to pay closer attention to what's happening in the brain in this particular kind of way. The other thing is that some of the early research really wasn't very rigorous. A lot of self-reporting and surveys and self-assessments that later morphed into use of more diagnostic and more rigorous control groups using first MRIs and then functional MRIs. And the difference, the functional MRI actually is like looking at a movie, a live movie where you see blood activating in different parts of the brain versus a standard MRI was just taking a snapshot, a picture in time. So when we can see live through fMRIs and we have control groups, we can get a better sense of what's really happening in the moment and whether things are directly related or not. And so when we look at some of the neuroscience, one thing we do know for sure, whether it's related or not to meditation, is that what we think, do, and pay attention to repeatedly over time changes the structure and function of your brain. I always tell people that's the great news. The not so great news is what we think, do, and pay attention to over time changes the structure and function of our brain. The brain doesn't care if it's something that supports you and helps you flourish or it's something that sabotages you. It just creates new grooves, highways, and you'll create a pattern, and so that then becomes your default way of thinking, of being. It's the way your brain will literally function. So I always ask people, why not be intentional about what you're putting into your brain? What's that inner critic and inner narrative? Can you reframe that? Can you change that? And the answer is yes, because the more you do something repeatedly, the more you create different circuitry and neural pathways. And so the easy way to sum that up is to say neurons that fire together, wire together.
Oh, I like that.
So why not choose where you're placing your attention and be intentional about it?
So that sounds amazing, and I totally get it. But I think for most people, it's like, how do you do that, right? I am 50, 60 years old.
Yeah.
I've been thinking this way for a long time. I am set in my ways. But I think even at that age, you can change
Yes,
the pathways.
absolutely.
And so how do you recommend people start, or how do you, is there, I don't know, is there some sort of method?
Mm-hmm. Well, I like to say that life is full and there's always an integrated way to do things. I'm not a fan of saying, well, here's the one way. So a number of ways can serve you, and part of our jobs is to figure out which one we'll stick with. Because if we won't stick with it, it doesn't matter how good it is, right? So when I think about where would I start, and sometimes people have a harder time seeing it in themselves. And a lot of times I'll teach a program and they'll go, oh, my boss really needs to be here, or my husband or my wife needs to be here, and nobody's really thinking about themselves. We all play a role in the play of our lives. So if we remember that how we show up matters, and that informs the quality and nature of our presence. So if we start first and bring a practice of mindfulness. So let's just, before we even talk about meditation, let's just be intentional about being mindful. Do you notice that you tend to be on autopilot? Do you ride the train and all of a sudden it's your stop and you don't remember passing by the last 3 stops? Or if you're driving, oh, I'm home already. I forgot I have to go to the store to get some milk. Are you on autopilot? Can you notice that? The part of being mindful is noticing when you're not. And so then redirecting. So in order to help you do that and cultivate that muscle, that's where mindfulness meditation can come in. Mindfulness meditation can help you learn to focus your attention. And there are really 2 types that I often teach about, and that is sort of this focused attention, where maybe you're focusing on your breath or sound or a visual. And anytime you notice that there's a distraction, and that distraction can be anything. A lot of people think distractions are, somebody said something, I heard a noise. Well, a distraction could be a thought. It could be...
You get a lot of distractions.
Yes, and lots of thoughts.
Yeah.
And my favorite itch, whenever you're trying to be quiet or sit, all of a sudden your cheek itches and so a distraction could be anything. And in mindfulness meditation, when you're doing focused attention, you just want to simply, again, bring that kindness and curiosity when you notice that distraction, and see if you can just kind of notice it and let it go. And that's a hard part, because it's in that noticing where a couple of things tend to happen as humans. One, we notice, gosh, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. I keep having thoughts. And then we notice, this is really hard. I don't know how to, you know what, that thing that happened, that was really awful, that made me angry. So we do a couple things. We say, this doesn't work. The other thing is we sit and we quickly go into judgment. And we get lost in a story around it. And before we know it, we're not meditating anymore. We're ruminating. So that's where noticing comes in. And if we see that we're doing that, it's okay. No judgment, just sort of bringing your attention back to your point of focus. And I don't always say the focus has to be the breath. In different lineages and practices, it is the breath. The reason why I'm a little broader, and I like to refer to it as home base, is because when you are working in body awareness, sometimes there's trauma that sits in our bodies. It sits in our cells in form of and in memories. And so when you start to really reconnect to your body, sometimes it's hard to do the breath first, because it can re-traumatize. It can bring up things that are you're not ready for, or don't have the supports in place to process. So, and sometimes we have people who come back from war-torn areas, might have experienced some things in first responder communities. And so I often will encourage, find a home base that feels safe for you. And maybe that is your knee or your big toe.
Wow. Yeah.
Or maybe that's the sound of the air conditioning. Or maybe it's the spot on the floor in that wood floor. So come back to your home base. Every time you notice that you have been distracted, just take a breath, come back to your home brace. Allow your breathing to settle into its own natural rhythm and cadence, so you're not trying to control it. And then it's a cycle. So you focus on your home base, you breathe, you notice a distraction, you try to meet it with kindness and curiosity, and then you gently and kindly reorient your attention back to your home base, your breath. And it happens sometimes if you're doing it for a minute, sometimes it happens 50 times in a minute. But that actually is the practice. And the fact that you're noticing it, whenever you notice it, at whatever point you notice it, it's working. And then with practice, it becomes easier to do, and the disruptions or the distractions seem to be less frequent. Now, the caveat, though, is that people think, oh, I did it. They have one, experience and like, wow, this was amazing. And then 2 weeks later, something blows up in their lives, and they go to meditate, and then they have all these thoughts, this monkey brain, and they think, this doesn't work. It was working before, but it doesn't work now. And the one thing I like to remind people is that everything happens in context. Oh. So you may have an amazing, incredible experience doing a meditative sit one day when everything is just beautiful. You're flowing on all 4 cylinders. The sun is shining, birds are singing, and your meditation was just like angels were singing. And then the next time, you might have some crisis going on in your life, and the experience is different. And it's all okay. And so we can't strive for perfection in it. What we're striving for is simply non-striving and being human and acknowledging in those moments of mindfulness our common humanity, our own vulnerabilities, but also our own power that resides within us naturally. And that's what we end up tapping into, and it allows us to move through the world more skillfully with clarity and compassion, most importantly.
Wouldn't that be, that's amazing. Is there a recommended length of time for people to sit quietly with themselves, whether it's meditation or,
I get that question all the time.
Like,
should I? I only do it this way.
Everyone wants a manual, right?
Well, here's what I would say. More is always great. But if you don't have time, and all you have time to do is to take 3 deep intentional breaths, take 3 breaths, and that is just as good. If you can do 5 minutes, do 5 minutes. If you can do 30 minutes or an hour, do 30 minutes an hour. But if you set up a framework where you say, I don't have 20 minutes or I don't have an hour, so I'm not going to do it today, then we end up not doing it. And especially when you're first starting, it can be very daunting to think I'm going to go sit for 10 minutes, let alone 30 or an hour. And so I ask and I invite people to start where they are. And maybe that's just when you get up out of bed and you put your feet on the floor and you feel your feet, the sensation of your feet on the floor, and that's bringing mindfulness to your movement. And then maybe you decide, after I brush my teeth and take my shower, I'm going to sit in that chair by the window for 2 minutes. And then eventually you say, well, that was 2 minutes? That was quick. I can do another minute. And you start increasing it. The goal is to live an integrated life. So what I just described about sitting in a chair, putting some time aside to do that's called a dedicated practice. But then there are many, many kinds of integrated practices that you weave in throughout the day. So for example, if you are in a meeting that is maybe a little contentious, a little tough, you might choose in that moment to pull an integrated practice to help ground yourself, to stay clear, to stay a kind of a presence in the room that is helpful and impactful for yourself and others. And so you may decide to take 3 deep breaths. And the beautiful thing about these integrated practices, I tell people you can do them in stealth mode. People don't even have to know you're doing. You got to breathe. So nobody's going to know.
Right.
But what you're doing is attaching an intention to each of the breaths, you know? So you might say, okay, the first breath, let me just relax or bring my attention to my breath. Second breath, notice my body. Where am I tense? Am I holding stuff in my shoulders? The body awareness piece is critically important, and I can tell you about that in a second. And the third breath, you may be asking yourself, what's important now? What can I do in this moment to help right this ship? What can I say or not say? Because sometimes being mindful and compassionate is actually not saying anything. That's still an action. It's still
It's
a
also
choice.
really hard sometimes.
It is.
Especially if you're from New York.
Yes, or from my family. But so yeah, we all have our personalities and we all have our styles. But if you're constantly asking yourself what would serve the highest good in this moment, we teach ourselves to get out of the frame of reference that it's all about me. And it helps us move closer and closer to compassionate behavior towards ourselves and others, and to recognizing our common humanity. We can see across the table somebody may be behaving badly, but you also recognize that there's some wounding, there's some hurt underneath that surface. It doesn't mean that you excuse or allow the behavior, but you can approach it differently. Because many times we take things personally when people do things. We think, we look at the impact versus the intention. And sometimes the intention doesn't at all match the impact that's given. So looking at ways to bring integrated practices throughout the day so that you can live an integrated life, the dedicated practices, I think, are what fuels your ability to do the integrated practices. The dedicated practices are important, and you can figure out whatever time. I love it. If I have a moment to do an hour sit, I would love it. I used to when I was less busy. I could do an hour. I would do a very quick sit in the morning, and then every afternoon when my son was younger, when he took his nap, I meditated the whole time. I would get a good hour in, and then I would do another quick one before I went to bed. That is not my life right now. So mine are more bursts. I do maybe 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there, or maybe sometimes I only have time for one breath, not even 3.
Wow, but it's the consistency.
Yes, yeah.
So you were also talking about body awareness, and
Yes.
this is something that someone just shared with me actually recently, which I find, I feel like we don't even realize how disconnected we are from our bodies.
Yes, yes. So I'll tell you a quick story. When I was, I did a retreat in 2013, I think, and the facilitator was talking about how body awareness and how a lot of people walk around with their shoulders all up here. And she's like, and they don't even know it. And then we took a break and I stood up and I'm like, how do they not know it? And I realized, oh my goodness, I am walking around with really stressed, intense shoulders. And it began to kind of pique my curiosity about what is this whole thing about body awareness and how is it impacting how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and how I'm showing up and interacting with others. And then over time began to learn a little bit of the research around it, which is really quite fascinating. And even now it's morphing as we learn more. Initially, we looked. There was some research that looked at different types of emotions and where people feel them. And there's one study that was done out of Finland in like 2013. Has done some follow-on things since then. And it was cross-cultural, cross-generational, cross-gender in Europe and Asia. And they gave silhouettes of the body, human body, on a piece of paper. And next to those silhouettes were, either a video or a word or a picture that sort of suggested a particular emotion. And they were asking people, where do you feel this emotion in your body? If you feel an increase in sensation, color it in on this silhouette. If you feel a decrease, color it in on this one. And if you feel nothing at all, don't color anything in. And then eventually what they did was they took all of those responses, superimposed each person's 2 silhouettes and came up with a composite, kind of what I call like a heat map of the body. That was very telling for us because what it suggested for one of the first times in a very clear way is that we all tend to hold the same types of emotions in the same general areas of our bodies. What that study doesn't do, what newer research is showing us, is that not everybody identifies the same experience as the same emotion. So you may look at a face and that may look like anger to me, but it looks like frustration to you, or it looks like confusion to you. And so there is some growing knowledge. So what's really important is just to understand your own body map. Whatever the label is for you, take a moment to figure out where it sits in your body. And one good way to do that is to think about, I like to conjure up 3 good emotions, right? Take a moment and sit and bring to mind something that is somebody you love, you would move heaven and earth for, that you just want them to be happy and you want the best for them, and you kind of sit there for a good few minutes just feeling them. And then you pause and figure out what sensations are showing up in your body. Some people describe feeling like their chest feels like it's blooming open like a flower, or they're feeling warmth. It could be anything. Make a note of that. And I say kind of make a mental map in your head. And okay, I feel it in my chest when I'm feeling love. Now take the same experience, the same exercise, and use it with fear and anger. And see where those show up in your body. And boom, you've got your body map. And so during the day when you're doing integrated practice moments, one of them might be, let me check in with my body. How's my shoulder? Because I know I hold stress in my shoulders. How's my stomach? I notice when I'm anxious, I feel stuff there. So you know with your own body map where to check in. And that gives information. And the reason that's important, because the one thing we do know is that emotions show up physiologically in the body, and they connect to the thoughts. So however we label the sensation that shows up in our body forms that thought. And then that is like a domino effect about if there's a story related to it, if there's past trauma related to it, if there's fear related to it. And then that allows us with that information to choose how we respond. And oftentimes that's when the inner critic starts to work, needs to be done, because we sometimes have to reframe a new truth around it. It's not that the act itself didn't happen, but we are reclaiming our power around it and how we wish for it to interact with us going forward. So I always say the lesson can stay, right? So pull the wisdom forward, but heal the emotional part of it.
Wow. So say, something's happening and, you feel anxiousness in your stomach.
Mm-hmm.
So once you can identify that, then you can try to create language that will shift. I no longer, is it the type of thing where you're like, I no longer feel anxious about this. I feel, I can feel calmness, or I can feel,
well,
turbulence is a big thing for me.
Turbulence. That's a good word. And I think a lot of us feel that. So the first point I want to make is that it's not about denying whatever's showing up. So it's not about saying, nope, we're not nervous. It's okay, because it might not be okay. So it's acknowledging what it is and telling yourself that you are okay. Like that okay, this is what's here. This is what's present. And you may need to use some mindfulness sort of meditation or practice to help calm the sensation so that you do have the emotional and mental capacity to process it in a healthy way. Because none of it is about suppressing, denying, avoiding. It's about allowing, with some sense of equanimity, whatever is present to exist and to meet it from a place that's healthy. And oftentimes when that happens, we do find we might need help outside of ourselves. So we may need to go talk to somebody. And whether that's somebody formal or informal, a friend, a therapist, or what have you. But part of the processing of it, after we notice it, is what do I need to do for my body to help it relax a little bit more into so that it's not so palpable. Now, the other thing is sometimes it's there to help us, right? So I'll give another example. When I first started doing keynotes, and I was terrified at public speaking. I would, even though I was a lawyer, I could do that, but there was just something about talking and in front of a room full of people and being the only one up there. And what I realized after watching, looking at some research and seeing a magnificent video of research by Kelly McGonigal on how to reframe stress, what I realized, if I told myself two things about how my body was feeling. I was feeling lots of stuff in my stomach, my chest was constricting, I was perspiring, my heart was beating fast, and I was telling myself, oh my God, I'm so nervous, I don't know how I'm gonna do this, I'm so nervous. I was drilling it, right? Yeah. So two things happened after I did the research, saw Kelly McGonigal's video, and realized that if I could interpret what I was feeling differently as something positive. So what I realized, what I said to myself was, I am nervous because I'm about to do something really important that means a lot to me. And my body is simply summoning the energy that's needed for what I'm about to do next. Number one. And number two, because I'm not interested in being the sage on the stage or the expert in the room, what I really enjoy is conversation and discovery. So I told myself, I'm not going out there to lecture anybody. I'm going out there to have a conversation. So those two things, telling myself that my body was just simply summoning the energy for what I was to do next, and that was important. So thank you, body. Yeah, I'm nervous, and that's okay. And the second was because I'm going out to have a really important conversation. And that
awesome.
began to shift how I showed up and how my body started to feel. I still feel nervous, but now I kind of celebrate it.
That is awesome. So what would you love for people to take away from our conversation?
Yeah, I would love for us all to not be so fearful and anxious about everything. Because there's a lot out there that we could say, well, this is a crisis. This is why I'm anxious. And yes, they're all real. And in fact, many of the things that we're watching and witnessing today, many are very scary. This isn't about not acknowledging that. This is about how do we ground ourselves so we can show up the best version of ourselves to meet that complexity that is here in the world. The crisis that we may face, crisis of trust, crisis of fill in the blank. This work is about us choosing to show up and stand up differently for ourselves and others in the world. And when we can do that, that creates a ripple effect that is so incredibly powerful and transformative for everyone that's in our wake.